Once again, we've got a new James Harden trade request to talk about, but this time, things are a little bit more complicated. The story right now is that Harden took a $15 million pay cut last year so that the 76ers could go out and sign guys like PJ Tucker, Daniel House, so that they could hopefully have a better shot at winning a championship. And Harden was operating under the assumption that the 76ers would extend him on a much larger deal during this offseason that we're currently in. Considering the 76ers now have his bird rights, they're allowed to go over the cap to sign him to a max contract extension, but it seems like that's not going to happen. Obviously, we don't know exactly what's being said or what has been said behind closed doors. We don't know exactly what promises have and haven't been made. And I can tell you for a fact, there's going to be a ton of reports coming out over the coming weeks and months as both parties involved are trying to gain leverage over one another in these negotiations. In this video, I'm not going to get into the specifics of who's right and who's wrong. There are other people that can do that. That's not something that I'm going to get into. I do, however, want to look at the potential reasons as to why Daryl Morey is taking such a massive risk in letting James Harden walk, because if you read between the lines, this is possibly part of a much bigger plan by the 76ers. But before we get any further, a quick word from today's sponsor. Huge thank you to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring today's video. Underdog Fantasy is my favorite way to play daily fantasy sports throughout the NBA and NFL seasons. I'm actually really excited to share that I'm going to be hosting multiple private drafts for the upcoming NBA season, and the first private draft is actually live right now. It's a 12-man league and there's only 11 spots left, so if you're interested in playing some fantasy basketball with me as well as some others from the community, you can click the link below to sign up now and join me. To make things even better, Underdog is matching your first deposit up to $100 when you sign up using code AlexHoops. So not only will you be able to join my draft, but you also have some left over to use on future drafts. If you don't manage to secure a spot in this draft, don't worry, I'm going to be hosting plenty more throughout the NBA season, so just be sure to be on the lookout for future drafts. But to sign up, just click the link in the description and use code AlexHoops. Once again, huge thank you to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get back to it. Now let me be very, very clear before we kind of dive into the weeds on this stuff. First of all, I'm going to be looking at this situation from a non-emotional standpoint. Like I said, I'm not here to talk about who's right or wrong. I just want to look at some reasons as to why the 76ers decided to go this route instead of just biting the bullet and paying Harden. Prior history shows that Daryl Morey deciding to not just pay Harden whatever he wants to try and win now, that's a fairly unusual move. In the past, we've seen a lot of teams just decide to pay these older guards that are starting to enter the later stages of their career because the alternative is to maybe head towards a rebuild. And a lot of teams who are in situations like the 76ers are right now, they're not interested in hitting a retool or a rebuild. Let's look at some prior examples of these older point guards that got big long-term contracts during the later stages of their careers. Let's start off by looking at a guy like Kyle Lowry. He was another point guard who was in his mid-30s at the time of his most recent contract. The Heat signed him to a 3-year, $85 million deal back in 2021. Now, if you look at his production during the season leading up to that contract, he was definitely still a good player. Lowry put up 17.2 points, 7.3 assists, and 5.4 rebounds a night on solid efficiency, and he played solid defense. So even though he was going to be on the wrong side of 30 at the end of this contract, the Heat decided that it was just going to be better to go ahead and pay him so that they could try and win now. And considering they've been back to the finals and made it to the Eastern Conference Finals since that deal, I'd say it probably for the most part paid off and they're not regretting it a whole lot. Even though they haven't won, it still resulted in them having a pretty good amount of success. Now, another example is Chris Paul. Chris Paul got a 4-year, $120 million deal with the 4th year partially guaranteed. He was 35 at the time and putting up 16.4 points, 8.9 assists, and 4.5 rebounds a night. His defense was, for the most part, holding up, and his efficiency was still there. I'm sure they probably would have hoped for better results throughout the duration of this contract. Considering they turned Chris Paul into Bradley Beal, I'm sure they're not too upset with how things turned out, at least for now. Now it's time for some perspective. James Harden is going to be 34 at the end of the month. He just came off a season where he averaged 21 points, 10.1 assists, and 6.7 rebounds a night. Obviously, you're not having James Harden on your roster for his defense, but I also don't think that was like the difference maker between why those guys like Kyle Lowry and Chris Paul got big long-term contracts even though they were older guards. That's just not enough of a needle mover here for me. To me, the reason why James Harden didn't get a long-term max contract extension boils down mostly to the 76ers financial situation, as well as the financial implications of the new collective bargaining agreement. Now, real quick, for those of you who don't know what the collective bargaining agreement is, it's basically this really long document that lays out all of the rules and financial restrictions of the NBA. I'm sure most of you know what it is, but I'm going to be referring to it as the CBA throughout the rest of the video, so I just didn't want anybody to be confused. Now, let's start things off by looking at Philly's cap situation. If they were to just sit tight with their current roster and not make any big moves throughout the rest of the season, even if they decided not to trade James Harden, they would only have 4 contracts on the books in the 2024-25 season. Now, depending on whose bird rights they announce, they could theoretically clear close to $70 million in cap space. Obviously, a good portion of that is going to go to Tyrese Maxey, who's going to be a restricted free agent next offseason, and there's a good chance they'd want to try and bring back a guy like Tobias Harris and a guy like DeAnthony Melton on probably a lesser contract than they're currently on, or something just a little bit more favorable for the team. But if they were to go this route, they could set themselves up pretty good in terms of their financial situation for this upcoming offseason. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, and I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, they have James Harden's bird rights. They're allowed to go over the salary cap to sign James Harden to a longer term contract extension if they wanted to. So why don't they just do that? This is where we have to take a look at the CBA. The thing that you need to know about the CBA is that it punishes teams that are paying into the luxury tax pretty heavily. The previous CBA didn't do a whole lot to try and deter teams from paying into the luxury tax, but that's definitely not the case anymore. The first one is set at $172 million. When a team hits the first apron, they're hit with the following punishments. They cannot acquire a player via a sign-and trade if trading for that player keeps them over the first apron, and they cannot sign a player that was waived during the regular season if their contract is more than the $12.5 million mid-level exception. The punishments for exceeding the first apron are definitely rough, but they're a lot worse once you get into the second apron. When a team hits the $182.5 million second apron, they're hit with the following punishments. They cannot use cash in a trade, they can't trade first-round picks that are 7 years out, they can't use trade exceptions that are created by aggregating the salaries of multiple players, they can't use a trade exception that was generated in the prior year, and if you remain over the second apron for 3 out of 5 seasons, your first-round pick is moved to the end of the first round. Now, my point with all of this is that Daryl Morey would be a complete moron if he didn't know about this. I'm sure he's very, very much aware of all of these new CBA implications. And that's probably the big reason why they decided not to give James Harden a long-term max contract extension. As currently constructed, they're not quite good enough to win a championship right now. So that means that they have to keep fleshing things out to try and get better, whether that's internal development of young guys or going out and trading for or signing other players to make the roster better. The problem is, if they were to pay James Harden a long-term max contract, their ability to actually build out the roster becomes almost impossible. It would almost certainly put them over the first apron and likely the second apron. That would pretty much forfeit their ability to build out the roster next offseason. If they felt like they had the opportunity and the ability to win a championship over the coming years around a core of Joel Embiid, James Harden, Tyrese Maxey, and their current cast of supporting guys, then they probably would have given him that long-term deal. So my guess is that Morey decided it would be smarter to just let James Harden walk in free agency next offseason or trade him during the regular season rather than locking themselves into this group of guys for the foreseeable future. A good contrast to kind of understand the thinking here is looking at a team like Boston. Right now, Boston believes that they're good enough to make a real run at the championship with their current core. That's evident by the fact that they made it to the finals 2 years ago, and they were in the Eastern Conference Finals last year. They believe that they can forego the flexibility that being under the luxury tax provides you, because in their minds, they're not going to need that flexibility. They're happy with the guys that they have. I simply don't think Philly trusts this current group of guys that they have to be good enough to win a championship. So instead of tying themselves to that ship, Morey's deciding to hit a quick retool next offseason and clear close to 2 max contract spots, and as a consequence of that, he's going to let James Harden walk. They're going to be able to trade Harden for whatever assets they can get and set themselves up to have a big free agency next offseason. And even if they trade Harden, they'll probably still be good enough to make the playoffs. Now, the big kicker here is that I'm operating under the assumption that Joel Embiid isn't going to request a trade, which that kind of seems unclear right now, considering he just took processing and Philadelphia out of his Twitter bio, and we don't really know what he thinks about all of this just yet. I'm sure we can take some guesses though based on what he did. Now let's say that hypothetically a new collective bargaining agreement hadn't come into the equation. Daryl Morey probably would have just gone ahead and given James Harden that long-term max deal. The 76ers wouldn't have had to deal with the punishments that exist now of being over the first luxury tax apron and the second luxury tax apron. They would have still had a level of flexibility that in theory would have allowed them to build out the roster. But due to this new CBA, you have to be really sure that your team is good enough to fight for a championship if you're going to give guys contracts that might be bad contracts. Because if you aren't sure and you lock yourself in, then you're going to be shooting yourself in the foot for years and years to come. So what do you guys think is going to happen with James Harden and the Philadelphia 76ers? Do you think Joel Embiid's going to request a trade now? Be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you guys enjoyed this video and you want to see more like this, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, all that good stuff. If you want to support the channel further, you can click the link in the description to become a patron now. Once again, thank you to Underdog for sponsoring today's video. Be sure to sign up for that draft using the link in the description down below. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.